Today, I want to share a story of a young woman betrayed by her own father and the Apache man who risked everything to save her. It's a tale of survival, of trust built in silence, and of two souls standing against power and lies. If this story reaches your heart, please help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Now, let's begin their journey. Red Bluff, Colorado Territory, April 1878. Dust moved like memory across the canyon, slow and deliberate. It curled under doors, clung to your boots, and settled deep into the lungs of men who didn't speak much. Nico Blackstone, Apache by birth and shadow by necessity, leaned against the post rail outside the Dini estate, arms folded over a chest carved from stone and sweat. He'd been riding the borderlands all morning, tracking a shipment of rifles Judge Dane claimed had been stolen. But Nico knew better. Most of Dini's enemies weren't thieves. They were men like Nico, made desperate by land that had once been theirs. Now, in the dying gold light, he returned not to rest, but to stand watch over a home that had never welcomed him. Above him, lanterns swayed gently on the porch beams of the great white house. Music filtered down in fragments, piano notes, laughter glasses clinking. Tonight was Leona Dane's engagement supper. She was being promised to the mayor's son, a stiff-jawed man with political ambition and calloused palms that had never worked an honest day. Nico wasn't on the guest list. He never was. 9 years he had served the judge, first as a tracker, then a fixer, then something not quite either. His loyalty was currency, his silence insurance. But no matter how many orders he followed, how many border skirmishes he ended before they flared, he remained a half-civilized savage in the judge's ledger. Tolerated, never trusted. He was 17 the first time he saw Leona. She'd been just a girl, then barefoot in the orchard sleeves, rolled face freckled with sun. Unlike her father, her gaze had been curious, not cruel. Not once did she flinch from him. That alone made her unforgettable. Now she was 24 and still carried that same defiant quiet in her spine. The years had refined her features into something striking, but her eyes held the same trapped intelligence. She stood near the window now, framed by velvet curtains, listening to the man beside her talk. She nodded in all the right places, but Nico could see her smile was hollow. She caught his gaze just once, only a flicker, and something wordless passed between them. He turned before it lingered. Later that night, back in the bunkhouse, Nico stripped off his trail dirty clothes and washed in a tin basin. The water turned rust brown, but it wasn't the kind of dirt that came off easy. His muscles etched with the quiet fatigue of someone who lived too much in seats himself. He sat on his cot, bare feet planted on the wooden floor. Listening far off, the party was dying down. Horses whinnied, laughter thinned, then something else, a thud, muffled voices, a scrape. Nico rose, knife in hand. He stepped outside into moonlight. The estate was quiet, too quiet. Then he saw at a servant's door ajar the trail of disturbed dirt, a fresh set of boot tracks, a drag mark. His stomach nodded. He followed the path, sprinting past the gardens, the orchard, down the slope where the trees thinned. At the edge of the lower fields near the ravine, he found it a torn scrap of fabric, pale silk leanness. The tracks veered east, 3 horses, maybe 4, moving fast, one unburdened until now. He knew that route. It led to the Badlands. No tones, no law, just dry gulches and men who answered to no one. He ran back to the stables, hard hammering. Ghost? His Mustang sensed it too. Eyes wide, breath snorting. Nico saddled fast. No saddlebag, no food, just his rifle knife and the kind of rage that lives cold and deep. He passed the main house on the way out. The judge's study window glowed amber. Inside, voices ease. "She's gone," said one, taken a pause. Then the judge let them take her. Silence. "But sir, the mayor, your alliance." "She's not my blood," the judge said flatly. "Never was. She's the price, that's all." Nico's blood assessed form. Leona discarded like a broken deal. He didn't knock, didn't speak. He rode into the night like a shadow on fire. By dawn he was deep in the bluff trails, following hoofprints only someone like him could read. He found a creek bed where the water had pulled around fresh prints. 3 horses, 1 riderless. A set of boot marks near the edge, one smaller than the rest. Someone had stalled. A broken branch caught on a bit of silk confirmed it. She was still alive. He pressed on the sun rising sharp behind him. As the heat built, so did his phases. He remembered her face, strong chin, the way her brows pulled when she read. He remembered how she had once handed him a book he could not read, and said softly, "You should learn. Your words are worth being written down." No one had spoken to him like that before, not even his own, and now she was taken, not for ransom, not for power. No, this was punishment. This was the judge cleaning up the past before it spoke. And Nico knew one thing: he would get her back, even if it meant tearing Red Bluff apart to do it. The sun climbed high and hot over the canyons by the time Nico reached the abandoned mining trail. He'd crossed dry riverbeds and thorny mosquite, tracked their path through shallow ridges and game trails known only to those who'd grown up among the rocks. The signs were clear now. 3 riders, 1 woman taken fast and hard. They made no effort to cover their trail. They didn't think anyone would follow, or maybe they thought no one would dare. Nico crouched beside a hoof print in the chalky soil. The spacing told him the horses had slowed. Less urgency. They were near wherever they planned to haul up. He scanned the terrain low, brush-jagged rock walls on either side, ahead a narrow break in the cliffs, a blind passage good for ambush or hiding. He left Ghost tethered beneath a bluff and moved forward on foot rifle across his back blade at his hip. Silence reigned except for the occasional buzz of flays and the distant cry of a hawk. Then he heard it, muted voices echoing faint from within stone. Laughter, a grunt, something dropped. He crept closer. A weathered opening appeared in the rock wall, partially hidden by brush. An old mine shaft, long abandoned, half collapsed, but deep enough to conceal men without morals. He eased close ears, straining. Inside, someone cursed, "Hold her still, damn it." Another voice, cruer, "Girl, don't have sense to scream no more." Nico's vision narrowed. He counted 2 voices inside. The 3rd man must have gone scouting. Good, he didn't hesitate. He burst through the brush like a storm blade first. The 1st man never got a hand to his pistol. Nico drove the knife straight under his rib, twisting hard before the body crumpled. The 2nd stumbled backward, reaching for a shotgun on him, but Nico was faster. He slammed into him fists like hammers. A punch to the jaw, then another to the throat. The man gurgled and fell choking on his own breath. Then silence, then breathing, shallow, ragged. Nico turned and saw her. Leona lay on the dirt floor, her wrists bound above her head, ankles tied tight. Her dress was torn and stained with blood, her skin pale, bruised, but her eyes were open, dazed, afraid. He crossed to her. "Fat, Leona," he said, voice low. "It's me, Nicock." She blinked, tried to speak, but her lips trembled. He knelt, cutting the ropes at her wrists. When he moved to her ankles, he paused, noticing the dark stain between her thighs. His stomach dropped. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice taut. Her eyes welled. "No, not like that." She whispered, It's just my time." It took Nico a second, then understanding dawned. Relief swept through him like wind over fire. "Oh," he murmured. "Okay." He didn't blush, didn't look away, just helped her sit up, wrapping her in his coat. Her hands trembled. "I thought you wouldn't come," she said. "I did, that was all." He helped her stand. Her knees buckled. He caught her, lifting her easily into his arms. She buried her face into his shoulder as he carried her out into the light. The sky was blinding after the cave. Her fingers clung weakly to his shirt. They made camp in a narrow ale, 5 mi from the mine, sheltered between rock spines. Nico made a fire from dried roots and boiled water. He gave her a tin cup, his coat still wrapped around her. She drank slow, her lips cracked and pale. "You knew where they'd go?" she asked. "I knew what kind of men they were," he said simply. "This is where I'd hide if I didn't want to be found." She nodded faintly. Silence stretched between them. Not awkward, just heavy, like something that had been buried too long. "Why did my father send them?" she asked finally. Nico didn't answer right away. He cleaned his knife with steady hands. "Because you're not part of the plan anymore," he said. Because you know too much. Her throat worked as she swallowed. He always hated me, she whispered. I just never knew how much. Nico looked up. He's not your father. Leona blinked. What? He set the knife down. I heard him say it to the mayor's envoy. Said you weren't his blood. Said he wouldn't pay to bring you back. She stared at him, lips parting. That's why he wouldn't come, she said. That's why he looked at me like I reminded him of a lie. Nico didn't speak. He knew what it was to be looked at like that. She pulled the coat tighter. I always thought if I was good enough, he'd see me like I mattered. Nico met her gaze. You do matter, just not to him. Her eyes burned, but no tears came. She was past that. What filled her now was colder. He'll come after us, she said. I know. She reached across the fire, her fingers brushing his. I don't want to go back. You won't. He said it like a vow. As dusk fell, Nico sharpened his rifle and gunned his knife. Leona lay under his blanket, watching the stars appear. The warmth of the fire licked her face, but it was his presence nearby that made her feel safe. Not saved, just not alone. He didn't ask for thanks, didn't speak of what came next. But as the wind picked up, whispering through the cliffs, they both knew this was just the beginning. Red Bluff wasn't done with them yet. The sun rose slowly behind the sandstone cliffs, casting long orange streaks across the scrubland. It was quiet in the Ayo, where Nico and Leona had taken shelter. The kind of quiet that settled only after fear had bled out and fatigue took its place. The air still held a bitter chill, and the fire from the night before had turned to ash. Leona stirred beneath Nico's coat, the pain in her limbs now dull, but persistent. When she sat up, her eyes met his across the small camp. He was crouched near the edge of the bluff, scanning the horizon. The rifle rested beside him, hands still but tense. She cleared her throat gently. He turned, stood, and approached. You all right? She nodded, wrapping the coat tighter. Sore, but alive, you slept. I didn't dream, she added. Not sure if that's a good sign. Nico, crouched by the fire pit, added a few twigs and rekindled the flames. Means your body's still holding on, that's enough. Leona watched him silently for a long moment. You always talk like you've lived 2 lifetimes. I have, he said, tone. Even by mid-morning they were on horseback. Nico riding ahead, Leona behind him on Ghost. The Mustang moved steady, used to the weight. Leona held on to him, her fingers digging into his sides for balance. They followed a ridge trail, narrow and winding, that overlooked Red Bluff in the far distance, a tiny cluster of buildings beneath the shadow of a white church steeple. Nico paused at a high outcrop and gestured. There, he said, that's where we're going. Leona frowned. Red Bluff? That's the last place we should. Not into town, he said, to the edge. There's someone there I trust. Mostly, Leona didn't reply, just held on as they rode again. They reached the outskirts of Red Bluff by dusk, keeping to back trails and mosque thicket. A weathered cabin sat on a hill above town, tucked behind rows of wild oak and an overgrown garden. Smoke curled from the chimney. Nico dismounted and led Ghost to the side corral. He helped Leona down gently. Inside the cabin, the smell of tobacco and old paper lingered. Maps lined the walls. A stovepipe hissed softly in the corner. Glenn, Nico called. A moment later, a man appeared from a side room, grizzled, sharpied somewhere in his 60s. He wore suspenders and a holster. His left eye was glass. Well, damn, he said. Didn't expect you back, and sure as hell not with her. She needs a place to rest. Nico said. Just a day or 2. Glenn's gaze narrowed. You realize who her father is. Leona stepped forward. I'm not his daughter, not anymore. Glenn looked at her, then back at Nico. Trouble. Nico nodded, coming fast. That night Glenn let them stay in the side room. It smelled of cedar and leather. Leona collapsed onto the cot, exhausted. Nico stayed by the window, rifle in his lap. She spoke calmly. How do you know him? Glenn. Nico's voice was low. He used to ride with the Rangers, quit after they burned my village, refused the next commission, said justice wasn't supposed to wear a badge, and he roasted you. He doesn't trust anyone, but he respects truth when he sees it. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Nico, when you heard them talking, my father, I mean, was he always planning to sell me off? He turned his gaze out the window. I don't think he ever saw you as a daughter, just a ledger item. You were a means to a contract. Leona exhaled sharp and quiet. I used to pray at that church every week. Believed if I just stayed dutiful, God would make it all make sense. Maybe that's the problem, Nico murmured. You were trying to make sense of something built on lies. The next morning, Glenn handed Nico a folded sheet of parchment. Got this from one of the courthouse clerks. Quiet, kid, owes me. It's a copy of Deanie's land deed updates from last quarter. Nico opened the paper. It listed a series of names, some crossed out, others newly added. Leona stepped beside him. My mother's land, she whispered, pointing. It was supposed to be left untouched in trust. But it's here, Nico said. Got aimed by sea. Leona's voice trembled. She died before he could take it. I remember her saying she left it for me. Her name should be on the deed, not his. Nico scanned the column. Look, this one dated 2 months after she passed. That's impossible. He forged it, Leona said flatly. He never owned the land, and if he lied about this, he's lied about more, Glenn muttered. A man who cuts up the past and repackages it for power. Don't stop at land, you need proof. Leona looked up at Nico. There's a safe in his study, hidden under the floorboard near the bookshelf. I've seen him go there after late-night meetings. Nico nodded slowly. Well, go tonight. That evening, cloaked in dark, they rode back to the Dane estate, keeping off the road. They left the horses tied beneath the ridge and approached on foot, hugging the tall grass line. The house was dim, most of the staff sent away after the engagement party. They entered through the rear servants' door. The study smelled of stale whiskey and gun oil. Nico crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling back the rug and prying up the floorboard. The safe waited beneath old and iron-bound. Do you know the code? He asked. Leona knelt beside Emmem, fingers trembling. He used the year he bought the judge's robe. I think 1865. The dial clicked, the latch gave. Inside were stacks of deeds, cash, and a small black book. Nico flipped it open. Names, payments, signatures, some with a red. This is it, he said. Everything he's done to buy power, the bribes, the silenced men. Look at this, Leona whispered, pulling out a folded page. It was a letter, her mother's handwriting. He found it, she said, breath-catching. He kept it to make sure no one else ever knew. Nico touched her shoulder. Now we do. From outside came the crack of a twig. The gun of voice. Drop it, both of you. They turned slowly. The sheriff stood in the doorway, revolver raised. I knew you'd come crawling back, girl. Behind him stood 2 deputies, guns drawn. Nico looked at Leona. She didn't blink, and as her fingers slipped into her coat, reaching for the small pistol Nico had given her that morning, he realized something. She wasn't afraid anymore. The moment froze, gunmetal glinting in lantern light. Leona's fingers tightening around the grip of her pistol and Nico's weight, shifting ever so slightly as he measured the 3 men across the room. The sheriff Rook Loyal was no fool. He'd been Deanie's hatchet man for over a decade, too clever for most and too cruel for the rest. The 2 deputies flanking him, Raleigh and Boone, looked like hounds let off a leash. Step away from the safe, Rook growled. You're both under arrest for trespass, theft, and attempted sedition. Sedition, Leona's voice, steady but cold, rang through the room. What law did you dig that one out of, Rook? My father's over the territories. You're not a Deanie anymore, sweetheart. Rook sneered. That name was your shield. It's gone now. Nico spoke then, voice like iron. She's not the one who should be arrested. Rook's eyes narrowed. You just don't know when to shut up, do you, Apache? No more words. Leona moved first. She ducked to the side, pulling the pistol from her coat. The first shot cracked, echoing off the wood-panelled walls. Raleigh cried out, his arm jerking as the bullet sliced through muscle. Boone lunged forward, but Nor was faster, crossing the room in 3 strides. He grabbed the lamp off the desk and hurled it. Glass shattered, flame roared. The sheriff stumbled back as oil caught on the curtain fire, blooming behind him. Nico slammed into Boone with his shoulder, driving him against the bookshelf. Wood splintered, a rain of old law books fell like bricks. Rook fired once, missing Nico by inches. Then Nico was on him, blade drawn, a flash of steel and fury. They wrestled through the smoke, the sheriff howling as Nico's knife cut a deep gash along his ribs. "Run!" Nico shouted over the crackle of flames, but Leona didn't run. She fired again, hitting Raleigh in the leg as he tried to rise. Then she turned, grabbed the black book from the desk, and sprinted to Nico's side. Together, they burst out the front door into the cold night. Smoke curled from the shattered window behind them as they tore across the front lawn and into the orchard. Ghost waited behind the fence hooves, restless eyes wild from the scent of fire. Reed and Nikiko barked, helping Leona into the saddle. He mounted behind her just as more shouts rose from the estate. Lanterns flared, gunshots cracked behind them. A bullet sang past Nico's shoulder, ripping through his coat. He leaned low, spurring Ghost forward. They vanished into the tree's wind, slicing their face. Its sea hooves thundering over dry roots and cracked earth. Behind them, the manor burned a fire started by accident, or she said, or perhaps justice. They didn't stop until dawn painted the maces with light. Near the edge of an abandoned ranch, they found a half-collapsed barn hidden between ridges. Leona slid from the saddle, her hands trembling, face pale with exhaustion. "You're bleeding," she said. Nico looked down, blood soaked his side, seeping from under his coat. "Not bad," he muttered. "Beast," she ordered. He didn't argue. She tore strips from the lining of her dress and cleaned the wound with whiskey from an old saddle flask. Her hands shook, but she worked with quiet determination. "Does it hurt?" "Yes, good." He smiled faintly. Once the bleeding slowed, she tied off the bandage and sat back, wiping sweat from her brow. "We almost died, but we didn't." She met his gaze. "You never hesitated back there in the study." He looked away, jaw tight. "I knew what we were walking into." "Just didn't expect the fire." Leona held up the black book. "This changes everything. It proves everything," Nico said. "Land theft, bribery, hired killings. He's been laundering everything through church charities and political fronts." She stared down at the names. "These men, they've run this town for years." "Not anymore." She looked up. "So what now?" "We expose them, but not in Red Bluff." "Not while they still hold the law." Leona frowned. "Then where there's a circuit judge in Santa Fe." And Nico said, "Clean honest, I rode escort for him once. He'll listen if we can get the evidence to him. That's a week's ride, and your wound I'll manage." She reached out, fingers brushing his. "You save me," she said. He met her eyes. "I've been saving you for a long time. You just didn't know it." Later that night, as they lay inside the barn, Leona couldn't sleep. The silence pressed down heavy, broken only by the slow rasp of Nico's breathing. She turned to face him. "Why do you care?" she asked quietly. He opened his eyes. "I mean, why me? Why not just walk away when you had the chance?" He didn't answer right away. "Then because I saw you." "What do you mean? The first time 9 years ago. You were sitting in the orchard reading. You looked up at me like I was human. No one else ever did." She exhaled slowly. "You think that's love?" "I don't know," he said, "but it was enough to keep me from becoming like them." She reached over, touched his bandaged side. "You still might die from this. I've died before, just not all at once." She smiled faintly. "That's a very Apache thing to say." "I'm a very Apache man." She leaned close, kissed his forehead, then lay beside him, her hand resting over his. Outside, the wind howled low through the ruins of the ranch. The wolves were coming, but for now, inside the bones of what once was, they had peace. The first 2 days on the trail to Santa Fe were harsh and silent. Nico guided Ghost along dry creek beds and ghost paths through the high desert, always watching the ridgel lines for movement. The sun bore down relentless, and the wind whipped dust into their eyes until the edges of the world blurred. Leona rode behind him, arms wrapped tight around his waist, her face pressed into the space between his shoulder blades. Her grip wasn't fear, it was exhaustion, every muscle etched, every breath tasted of grit and old smoke. But she never complained. Nico bled through his bandage by the second night. They stopped at an old sheep herd's cabin, tucked inside a craggy veil of pinon pines. The roof had half collapsed, but the stones still held warmth, and the broken hearth took to fire. As Leona stoked the flames, Nico collapsed onto the floor, sweat pouring down his temples. "You're burning up," she murmured, fingers pressed to his cheek. "I've had worse. That's not an answer." She boiled water, tore more cloth from her underdress, and did what she could to clean the wound. It had reopened during the ride, red and angry. She ground dried sage from Nico's pouch, made a bitter pus, and pressed it to the skin. He didn't flinch, but his jaw clenched hard. "I don't want you to die before we get there," she said. "You didn't used to care." She looked up sharply. "That's not fair." His eyes softened. "I know." They sat in silence for a while, the crackle of fire between them. Outside wind slid through the pines like whispered warnings. "You think they're close?" Leona asked. Nico nodded. "If not now, then soon. Sheriff Rook's too proud to stop chasing, and your father, he's too afraid of the truth getting out." Leona clutched the black book to her chest. "I still remember thinking I'd marry into safety," she said quietly. "That's what my father promised. But every man at that party looked at me like a business ledger." Nico's voice came low. "You deserve better than promises made by men with knives behind their backs." She stared into the flames. "Do you believe people can change, Nico?" He thought about it a long time. "No," he said at last, "but I believe they can choose who they become next." They rode again at dawn. Nico's fever broke during the night, and though the pain still gnawed at his side, he sat straighter in the saddle. Leona's pistol rested at her hip now, not hidden, not for show. They crossed into New Mexico territory by mid-morning, the terrain widening, stretching flat in places, then folding into red hills and arroyos. The road to Santa Fe curved through hard country, scattered pueblos, old missions, and canyons that swallowed light. At midday on the third day they found trouble. The riders came fast, 4 of them, faces masked, guns drawn, hired men, not law, mercenaries. One raised a rifle and fired a warning shot. Dust kicked up inches from Ghost's hooves. Nico turned hard, forcing the Mustang up into the rocks. They dismounted behind a low rise, took cover between sandstone ledges. Leona dropped beside him, panting. "They followed us. They're not lawmen," Nico muttered. "They don't care if they shoot first." Gunfire cracked overhead. Pebbles sprayed their faces. Leona covered her head, then reached for her pistol. Nico's eyes flicked to her. "You know how to shoot." "No," she said, "but I know how to aim." He passed her the spare rifle from his saddle bag, whispered instructions. "Wait for my signal. Don't shoot unless they close in." He crawled along the ridge, circled wide, ghosting through brush and rock. 2 of the gunmen advanced reckless, overconfident. One lit a cigar as he moved, grinning like a dog who thought the fight was already won. He never saw Nico. One swift blow to the throat, a knife through the kidney. The other man turned at the sound, only to take a rock full in the face. Then Nico's fist breaking his jaw. Both collapsed without firing again. Gunfire echoed as the last 2 advanced on Leona's position. She waited, then rose. The rifle cracked. One man tumbled backward, his shoulder shredded. The last turned to run, but Nico dropped him from behind a clean shot through the calf. The man screamed, then whimpered into unconsciousness. Nico returned to Leona's side, breathing hard. She lowered the rifle. "I only meant to scare him." "You did." He glanced at the wounded men. "But you can't keep thinking fear is enough." Leona looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking. "Then I'll learn." That night they camped in a dry canyon, surrounded by rock spires. The stars stretched clear and endless overhead, and the moon was thin, sharp like a blade. Nico sat sharpening his knife, while Leona read through more of the black book. She looked up. "There's a name here I recognize, Judge Hurst. My father always said he was incorruptible." "Then maybe he's the one we need." She nodded. "He lives outside Santa Fe, a day's ride from the capital." Nico tied off his blade. "Then that's where we go." She closed the book. "I don't want to just hand this off. I want to testify. I want people to hear it from me. You sure I'm tired of being someone they speak over or use or sell?" He looked at her, really looked. "You're not the girl I carried out of that cave." She reached out, touched his arm. "You're not the man who stood in shadows either." He covered her hand with his. They didn't kiss, not yet. But something in them shifted, rooted, grew deeper than need or rescue. It wasn't just love blooming. It was loyalty. Respect and pain shared like a burden made lighter. They reached Judge Hurst's homestead at dusk the next evening. A ranch house built from adobe and stone sat beside an old cottonwood grove. No guards, no servants, just a man with silver hair and tired eyes sitting on a porch with a journal in his lap. "Judge Hurst," Leona called as she dismounted. The old man looked up, his eyes narrowed. "You're Deanie's girl." She walked forward, book in hand. Not anymore. Behind her, Nico stayed mounted, watching the horizon. "We need 10 minutes, she said. "That's all." The judge took the book. "Read a few pages and didn't look up for a long time." The morning sky over Santa Fe was a wash of pale gold streak with slate blue, where night still clung. In the courtyard of Judge Hurst's adobe estate, the seekers were quiet. So were the people. Nico stood near the arched gate, rifle in hand, his eyes tracking every rider who passed the distant road. The town below was waking. So was the danger. Inside, Leona sat across from the judge at a heavy oak table. The black book lay between them, opened wide. Hurst had been reading for hours. Every page turned with the gravity of law. "I knew Deanie was ambitious," Hurst said finally, "but this is beyond ambition. This is treason." Leona's hands were folded tight in her lap. "Can you bring it to court?" "I can," he said, "but it won't be cleaned. He's paid off. Half the circuit has friends in the territorial office. Even in Santa Fe, I'll be fighting a stacked deck. I'll testify," she said quietly. "I'll name every man, every deal, every false contract he ever waved under my nose." Hurst looked at her long and hard. "You understand what you're walking into?" "I do now," he nodded once. "Then we ride at dusk quietly. I'll have you both under protection until the hearing." She exhaled, shoulders finally easing. Nico entered, closing the door behind him. "They're here?" Juliana asked. Rook and 4 riders saw them passing through the southern ridge. "They're following the scent." Hurst stood. "I'll call for federal marshals." "You won't have time," Nico said. "They'll move before dusk." The judge looked at them both. "Then we hold them off long enough to ride." That afternoon passed like a slow drag of thunder across a clear sky. Judge Hurst armed 2 of his ranch hands and barricaded the front gate. Leona helped pack the pages of evidence into a canvas satchel while Nico checked the ammunition and oiled the rifles. "I thought it would feel more triumphant," Leona said as she loaded bullets with shaking fingers. "Justice never does," and Nico replied. "It's just a quieter kind of violence." She turned to him, eyes searching. "You think we'll survive this?" "I think we've already survived worse." She nodded, and for a moment that was enough. At twilight they heard the hooves, not galloping, stalking. 5 riders moving through the brush below the property line. Nico watched from the stable's second window, tracing their shadows like predators circling a barn. "They're waiting for darkness," he said. "Then we move first," Hurst muttered, handing Nico a Winchester. "If they want blood, they'll find mine won't come easy." Leona moved behind Nico, strapping her pistol to her hip. "I'm not hiding." He turned to her. "You should." "No, if this is the end, I want to face it on my feet." He stared at her jaw tight. "Then don't hesitate." "I won't." The first shot came just as the sun dipped behind the hills. One of Rook's men perched behind a mosque tree, fired toward the house, the bullet burying itself in the adobe wall beside the door. Nico returned fire, dropping the shooter with a clean shot to the shoulder. Then chaos. Gunfire erupted from both flanks. Dust clouded the air. A second man rushed toward the fence, but Hurst's ranch hand cut him down before he made it halfway. Inside the gate, Leona crouched low. Pistol drawn, breath fast, but focused. Rook charged with another rider, aiming for the side entrance. Nico met him head-on, diving from the stable roof in a blur of buckskin and steel. He knocked the second man from his horse, then turned to face Rook. The sheriff raised his pistol. "You should have stayed on your damn reservation." He spat. "I never had one," Nico said. The 2 men lunged. They fought like animals, punch his elbows blood. Nico's side wound split open again, but he didn't fall. He ducked a wild swing, slammed his forearm into Rook's throat, and drove them both to the ground. The pistol skittered across the dirt. Leona ran toward it, scooping it up just as Rook rose behind Nico, blood dripping from his mouth, eyes wild. He reached for his knife and froze. Leona stood 5 feet Away, pistol aimed at his chest. Don't, she said. Rook hesitated, then he lunged anyway. The shot echoed like a final breath. Rook dropped to his knees, surprise etched across his face, then collapsed forwards into we. Violence returned like a falling curtain. The surviving riders fled. The ground was littered with bullet casings, footprints, blood. Leona dropped the pistol hand. Shaking, Nico caught her before she hit the ground. I didn't want to, she whispered, but you did what you had to. She looked at him, her voice breaking. Does that make me like them? No, he said. It makes you free. 3 days later, they stood before the territorial court in Santa Fe. Judge Hurst presented the evidence. Leona read her statement with a steady voice, naming every man, every crime, and her own father as the architect of the corruption. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Within a week, warrants were issued, assets frozen, the Dane estate seized. Leona refused to attend the sentencing. Nico waited outside the courthouse, leaning against a pillar in the morning sun. When she stepped out, she didn't speak, just wrapped her arms around his chest and held tight. What now? He asked. We go, she whispered. Where? Anywhere. The road's long and the past can't catch us. They left that night. No ceremony, no goodbye. Just a man and a woman. Saddlebags full of truth and blood still drying on their memories. They rode west past the mountains and rivers, chasing a kind of peace no law could grant, and as the stars wheeled above Nico, reached for her hand. Leona didn't let go. They rode south until the land changed again, until the tall pines gave way to gay and brittle brush, and the stars at night hung lower, larger, as if daring them to dream. Somewhere past Los Cruces, they traded ghost for 2 sturdy horses, no names, just hooves and heat, and kept riding until their past no longer whispered behind them. In a small valley outside a border town called Socorro del Norte, they founded a shack half swallowed by dust, a stream that hadn't dried up, and a grove of cottonwoods that turned silver in moonlight. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. The first few weeks were hard, the kind of hard that didn't make the stories. They built a shelter with hands still calloused from fight. Nico hunted and trapped, teaching Leona how to skin a rabbit, how to move without breaking silence. She worked the soil-dug trenches for beans and bitter greens, and learned to build a fire from flint and bark instead of matches. They rarely spoke of Red Bluff, or the blood, or the trial that turned her father's name to ash. But in the quiet moments when Leona stirred cornbread over a smoking pot, or Nico mended his coat in the last of the daylight, they would sometimes meet eyes. And that look said everything. They had survived, and not just the danger, but the rot that lived in them too, in the wounds and doubts and what-ifs. Leona once asked as they watched smoke curl from the chimney into dusk, "Do you think we'll ever be good again?" Nico had looked at her for a long moment. "We were never bad," he said, "just broken." One morning they woke to distant hoof-beats, not fast, not aggressive, just one rider. Nico's rifle slung low and stood in the doorway. A U.S. Marshal approached, coat, dusty hat, tilted low. He dismounted slowly and tipped his hat. "Morning," he said. Nico didn't speak. The Marshal glanced past him, saw Leona in the cabin's shadow. "I come with news, not trouble," the Marshal said. "Judge Hurst wanted me to find you. Thought you should know." Leona stepped forward. "Know what?" The Marshal pulled a paper from his coat. "An official notice signed and sealed. D&E died. Took a knife in territorial prison. Said nothing even at the end." Leona didn't move. Her face gave nothing away. He left no will, no heir. Estate's been dissolved. Most funds redistributed to reparations and land claims. The Marshal looked between them. "That's all I had to bring. Good day to you both." He rode off without waiting for thanks. Only after the dust settled did Leona speak. "I don't feel anything. You're not supposed to," Nico said gently. "That's what grief is when it's used up." That night she sat beneath the cotton, wood with her arms wrapped around her knees. The wind picked through the branches, a fire cracked nearby. "He hated me because I reminded him of her," she whispered. Nico sat beside her, his shoulder warm against hers, "but I don't remember her face. I only remember how cold his was. He didn't try to fix it, just waited." "You think a life like this is enough?" she asked. "Out here hiding? Living in inches instead of miles?" He didn't hesitate. "It's not hiding," he said. "It's choosing." She looked at him, eyes tired but alive. "I used to think I was meant for something big, something public, important. You were, but now he took her hand, calloused, warm, alive. Now you're here, still standing. That's important too. Over the next months, the cabin turned into a home. The land gave more than it took. Chickens eventually, 2 goats. Nico built a corral from dead wood. Leona sewed curtains from old flour sacks, and once a month they rode to town for supplies where no one asked questions because they didn't need to. Every now and then people stopped by. Travelers, drifters, ex-soldiers, women with no name. Some stayed a night, some 2, all were fed, some were healed. One girl no more than 16 arrived bleeding and barefoot. Leona washed her feet herself. Nico offered her a cut in the lean tube. The girl left 2 days later, said nothing, but left behind a silver earring and a bundle of wild flowers. Leona pinned the flowers above the hearth. We're building a church. She joked once. Nico just smiled. Not the kind you kneel in. Then came the baby, not... There's a basket left by the door at dawn, wrapped in homespun and an old army coat. No note, just a quiet whimper. Leona stared at the child for a long time, then lifted it into her arms. She never asked who the mother was or where she'd gone. She just fed the baby goat's milk from a cloth and held her through the night. They named her Clara. By spring, the scars faded some, not gone, but not open anymore. Leona planted flowers near the creek, wild lupines, bright and defiant. Nico made a cradle from cottonwood carved smooth with gentle hands. One night, under a sky filled with stars and coyotes howling far off, they sat outside with Clara sleeping between them. She'll never know what we came from, Leona said. She doesn't need to. Leona smiled. I hope she grows wild. She will, but not lost. They watched the fire until it died down to coals. Then Nico looked at her, voice low. I never told you. What, when I first saw you, you were reading under the orchard tree. Red dress, dirt on your knees. I remember the dress, she said softly. I didn't know you were watching. I always was. She took his hand, and this time they did kiss, not because the story told them to, but because the silence between them had finally softened enough to hold it, and somewhere in that quiet stretch of high desert, where law had failed and truth had once burned 2 people, carved a different kind of justice, not with bullets or sermons or power, but with presence, with staying, with fire that didn't burn everything down, only enough to make room for something better. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of this story. I'm truly glad you stayed with me. Your support means so much. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel so I can keep bringing you more heartfelt stories like this one.